And we often say the benefits of space we want for all. But again, what does that look like in reality? I don't know if it's a conundrum or a paradox, but if countries with fairly advanced space programs start imposing regulations or whatever building material constraints, is this a barrier to entry for other states that, want to benefit from the utilization of space? And just these conversations that I think we have to be aware to.
Hey, Space Watchers, and welcome back to Space Café Radio. Space sustainability was the talk of the town, or the space village over the last years. But did the priorities shift? ? I'm sure my guest will have all the answers for that. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Nick Ross, the CEO and founder of NIPARO and co-author of the third NIPARO Summit report on space sustainability. Nick has been at the forefront of research and policy discussions on orbital debris liability and in-orbit innovation, bringing together academia, industry, and governments to ask the tough questions about how we keep space safe, secure, and sustainable for the long term. Nick, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's an absolute delight to be here and talk about something that's very important to me.
Cool. So let's set the stage. The third NIPARO Summit happened in May this year in Edinburgh, and it was called Next Steps in Orbit Innovation and Insurance. And you brought together a number of people from academia, industry, policymaker to tackle the challenges of space sustainability. So far, correct?
Yes, 100%. I'll give it again a little bit of context or background. What I noticed a few years ago was the conversation about space sustainability was a tiny bit fragmented, or at least industry knew what it was doing. Academics, both in kind of technical research, but also legal space research, were making progress. And obviously the UK in general and Scotland in particular was discussing a lot about space sustainability. So we set up the NIPARO meeting to bring all those bodies, all those thoughts together, recognizing, especially as I say, actually in Scotland, that there was a critical mass of academic legal experts, business legal experts, was obviously strong space sector representation, and try and make some what I call tangible progress. And this was the third time we'd held the summit.
Wonderful. And I just recognized that I pronounce it in a good German way. It's NIPARO, but it's NIPARO, of course. But okay, let's talk about the definition of sustainability, because as you said, I think everyone has its own one. How does the summit define sustainability? Is it about orbital debris, insurance models, or something broader?
Yeah, I think, again, this is already we get into the weeds, that there's a lot of definitions, UN Copious, there's a Space Sector Scotland definition, which builds on that. But I think what we recognize is that we want to have almost the whole space sector supply chain being used in a way that can be for the very long term, so that resources are either recycled or reused, obviously. And there's just some recognition that you don't have infinite resources. And I think two things that kind of spring out to me in this is that, and again, there's leading academics, Glasgow Caledonian University, thinking about this a lot, the whole life cycle assessment kind of thing, the whole LCA life cycle assessment. And then obviously orbital debris is a huge part of this, but not the only part. And we try and actually think about that kind of whole holistic picture, that it's all connected, and it's the whole idea of what does sustainable mean in this context. And that's one of the questions we do grapple with.
No, absolutely. And I think we shouldn't ignore the philosophical angle on that. Is anything in the space sector truly sustainable? I mean, given resource use, orbital debris, and launch emissions, at least from my point of view, and I'm not a philosopher.
No is the quick answer. I think a little bit of hypocrisy maybe starts to creep in. And it's governed by physics, right? So you need a lot of energy in a small amount of time to place things into orbit. And that is quite tricky to offset or think about. But what I also think is very interesting is there's obviously quite visible aspects such as launch or the space debris. But what I also think is quite interesting, and actually this was research done by astronomers who looked at basically carbon footprints of astronomy emissions, that things like supercomputing can be very energy intensive, for example, and especially if you're running 24/7, 365 days a year. And supercomputers are used to analyze a lot of Earth observation data, which is, of course, of great importance and of great potentially commercial use as well. So there's that aspect that I think is very interesting. So no is the quick answer. I don't think the space sector is sustainable. Let's see if we can make some progress here.
That's an interesting thought thread, bringing up this kind of second or third level degree of sustainability when we talk about the usage of computing power as well for analyzing all the data that we are bringing home from these missions. And that it will not end where we are today if we're going to exploration, if we're going to settlements on the moon, not even talking about Mars. We have petabytes of data going back and forth. That creates potentially its own challenge. But please, go ahead.
Yeah, no, again, I couldn't agree more. And I'm absolutely not an expert, but I think that's when you do these life cycle assessment, LCA analysis, you have the scope 1 and the scope 2 and the scope 3, and it's the different second or third hands. But no, it's, as I say, it's almost governed by laws of physics for what we need to do and how from computing, etc. So it's that whole discussion.
Let's have a look on space. Space as an environment or an ecosystem. So when we talk about space sustainability, we are treating outer space as an environment, like a backdrop. Or should we begin to see it as an ecosystem with its own dynamics?
Yeah, I think this is, again, a philosophical deep question, but it does start to frame it very well. The quick answer, having had a little bit of thought about it, is I'm not sure. I think we can absolutely say there are interactions in space of a natural nature. So the region or the volume that we call low Earth orbit interacts with the upper atmosphere. Of course, it interacts with the solar activity, solar wind. So from that point of view, there's natural interactions. But one of the many epiphanies I had is, again, it's not very bio, it's not very eco space. And I think in some ways, the only organism that really benefits right now from this environment is humans. So it's a little tricky for me to say this is an ecosystem in the same way that I think about even the deep oceans or what have you.
I can tell you what triggered that question on my end, reading the report the summit discussed on the fly tipping and the impact of metallic particles on the Earth's atmosphere. And that's why I thought, okay, we know there is an effect or it is research, but it's widely ignored at the moment while talking about sustainability. I mean, the upcoming Space Sustainability Summit of the Secure World Foundation this year in Paris will tackle that element as well, what I think is great. But seeing all the dynamics that we have at the moment, that's why I came up with the question. So what is space? How do we treat space here? And maybe you can give us your view on these metallic particles.
Oh, absolutely. And this is something I think that, again, is now very much to be researched and to have influence on governments or policymakers to think about more carefully. And for that matter, for space operators to think about more carefully. I'm a bit of a journalist, as in knowledge maybe a mile wide, but an inch deep. So there's other upper atmosphere experts for sure. But I think what the take-homes from me, at least as I understand it here, are, although there's a lot of natural material that falls onto the upper atmosphere, and probably that's been known for a while, I think it's the composition of the material that we're now talking about. It's these metal oxides, these aluminum oxides, again, the rare earth metal. And I think a lot of the chemistry is not very well understood. And I'd say that as a kind of almost posing a research problem, as in we don't know, or at least we're still a bit more ignorant there, especially at these high altitudes where the measurements are difficult to make. And so we have these aspects. I think work is being done. It's a little unclear where this gets funded. I think, again, ESA's pushing it. I think the UK Space Agency is doing a little bit of work here. And so I think what happens next is we have to figure this out. But I will say one thing, and this was a quote actually made at an ESA workshop a couple of years ago. You might not want to put your head next to an exhaust of these satellites that are being burnt up. You're pretty sure that it's not going to be super good for you.
Got it.
Yeah. And then how that then obviously percolates into the upper atmosphere, I don't know.
Let's move on. As we obviously can't fix this issue, humans are very good in forgetting what they have done. are in the past. And I would like to shed a bit of a light on lessons from Earth crises that we had before. So are we in danger of repeating the same mistakes we have made with climate change, even with the COVID pandemic, or acting too late, ignoring scientific warnings, and then scrambling in a crisis mode? That's a pattern that we're seeing again and again. Are we doing it the same with space?
I think so, yes. With maybe one significant difference, and as I say, I alluded to this above. So I think what's come home or impinged on me, especially in general, it's often very hard to get consensus. And I think it's very hard to get international geopolitical consensus. And I think it's incredibly hard at the moment to get that kind of worldwide consensus on rules of the road or operating on how this works. So I think what's become quite apparent is you have to do some very kind of loose steps first. And for example, make a statement such as there are more satellites in orbit now than there used to be. There are more satellites deorbiting than there used to be. And we don't know the deep effects. And I think you could try and get consensus where you can, especially as we kind of were touching on, still quite tricky technical or research issues. But I think the big difference that hammers home to me is I think humans are the ones that are going to suffer. You know, if we make space unusable, for example, I think it's us that loses out, or at least the most. So I think we are repeating the same mistakes. I think there's a little bit of learning, but if that's enough, I don't know. And especially when you talk about going beyond, for example, low Earth orbit, how we look to go to the moon and how we behave there, that's a brand new conversation, which I think we need to have now. And there's so many mistakes we can repeat.
Yeah. But the UK is really on the forefront, and at least from my point of view, when it comes to sustainability, even to the highest monarchical level with the King and the Astro Carter, you're setting the stage. And with the UK Space Agency, still in existence, was very vocal on that topic. So do you think that it will lose tension in the UK? Or let me reframe it. So what should policymakers learn from those crises when designing space sustainability frameworks?
I do actually agree that I do think the UK has found a good niche, a good leadership here, and has been doing well. I think on some levels, what has surprised me, at least from the UK's space sustainability push, and I'll see if this gets to the answer, is that, again, it's been quite industry focused. It's been essential commercial companies that have been backed rather than deep scientific consensus. And so I think I wouldn't have predicted that a while ago, a few years ago, but that's how it's come to pass. And so I think if you can harness this kind of commercial interest and alignment, plus take on board some of the leading research in upper atmosphere physics, or again, in general, climate crisis knowledge and lessons learned, I think this is a way forward that UK policymakers, for example, can action. I think it's been quite interesting that Scotland has also been at the forefront within the UK, thinking about a lot of these things. Scotland's, again, geographically well placed for launches, but also for renewable energy. And I think that actually this was one deep point made at the summit 30 years ago. It was totally not obvious that the majority of Scotland's electricity would be coming from wind power in 2025. There was not a single wind turbine. And so these shifts, they take years, but they can be very paradigm shifting and sometimes coming from, where you don't expect, even by the experts. And that was a very interesting point that kind of, again, resonated with me.
I would like to shift a bit our gears here now and have a look at insurance liability behavior change. So the NIPARO Summit put strong emphasis on insurance and liability. Can insurance really drive sustainable behavior in orbit?
I think it can. And again, let me just give it a tiny bit more placement or context that I was quite interested in this in general. And actually, there was a UK government consultation at the end of 2023 into 2024, which I think a lot of people submitted evidence to. And it was essentially looking at insurance limits, especially when discussing novel missions and how best to address those. And actually, that consultation was quite in depth. From what I was told, it's still ongoing. And actually, we may yet see an outcome and some policy decisions there, which would be fascinating. So I thought this was a legitimate way forward. And I think it's absolutely one of the levers that you can use. I think the connection was made that people say space insurance like car insurance, or maybe, I don't know, but I think there's actually quite a big difference. And for me, that's essentially, it's from the UN treaties that you have a liability convention. And so the liability convention then obviously flows down into domestic legislation for the countries, the states that have signed up. And then individuals are responsible for space activities, states are. And so what are the insurance and the indemnity ramifications therein? And so I think if your state has signed up to the liability convention, then you're thinking about this. And if you apply your domestic legislation in such a way that actually there's a very easy win, you could potentially think that a more sustainable mission, again, how do you measure that to be defined or to be decided, has lower insurance premiums, then that's something that you'd obviously think could be a way forward. So I think that was the motivation.
I think here we are on a critical point, in my opinion, in seeing the insurance industry over the last decades. The space insurance industry insured the big satellites, the big buses in GEO. That's where also the big premiums came from, and where they had really a hands-on being involved in the processes to assess the risks that a satellite have. And what I understand from the insurance industry, that small satellites, low Earth orbit mission in that case, are not insurable and might never be insurable again, because we hit this tipping point of risk in low Earth orbit. So it sounds a bit like contradictory to what you just said. We do have these models with the sustainability rating of what's initiated and others. We have these initiatives, but sometimes they're, for me, sorry for my friend, but they sound a bit like a toothless tiger here. So they're not having a grab.
I can't disagree strongly. I think the case study I would give, again, I appreciate it's quite UK based, but just bear with me, that what I think is very interesting is that the UK made a big push, again, I guess about 10 years ago now, to get sovereign launch. And the outcome of this was the UK's Space Industry Act 2018. And this was a major piece of space legislation. And I would say that still hasn't been tested end to end, a full systems test, because there's not been a mission that's been completed under that legislation and the licensing therein, the orbital licensing, etc. I'd be remiss not to mention it. There's actually been a small update, a small but significant update to this Space Industry Act, which is literally going through the Parliament at the moment. And that is an update of one word, essentially. I guess technically it might be two words. But it's the word changes may to must, and it's an insurance requirement. And so it's industry motivated, it's commercially motivated, so that essentially investors or businesses can be more certain about the terms of a complex mission, for example. So it's motivated from that way. But I guess my point is that giving certainty can often have unforeseen benefits. And yeah, I think this is a key point. I think a lot of satellites in low Earth orbit are uninsured, and it's unclear what the commercial risk or that looks like. But I know the space companies that are thinking about this, wanting to do better, and what this looks like in the future, especially if there's a commercial gain to be had, I think will be figured out. So yeah, I don't think we're there yet, but things are in progress.
We're talking about it here in a time where the EU, and I'm fully aware that the UK is not part of the European Union anymore, but that the EU is bringing forward the EU Space Act as a regulatory framework. At the same time, by August 13th, we saw the executive order of Trump of deregulating space in a large scale. And that sounds a bit really awkward with our European understanding to say, okay, we have to bring in regulation even before we are messing up things or things go south. But that might be potentially just too idealistic point of view that we have.
Let's absolutely get into it. From what I understand, there is a EU Space Act has been announced, and I think there's even a new draft recently in the last week or something. And I guess from my own ideology or personal viewpoint, I think often the word regulation is seen as it inhibits innovation, it's a bad thing, et cetera, but it's the reason I get on an airplane, right? And I have some certainty that I'm going to get off the other end. And I think if done well, good regulation, which is hard to do, can actually be incredibly useful for innovation. Basically, you have mission requirements. You have very strict written down I've got to hit these requirements. And that's very useful for designing a mission. It can be good for investors or good for business. It's okay. We have an envelope where we know what we can and can't do. But getting that balance right is obviously tricky. I'm actually quite fiercely European, even though everything's perfect by any means. I feel ideologically, again, and even as far as space regulation and especially space sustainability regulation, I actually think the UK and the EU are going to be pretty closely aligned ultimately. Yeah. In some ways, I'm not too worried there. I think you obviously have a huge common ground in ESA. And so in some ways, I'm not as worried about that as I used to be. But I think, obviously, you have to recognize the US is still the major superpower. Yeah.
Let's come back to your summit. One of the most striking themes from the summit was sustainability, but for whom? And I love this question. So maybe you can enlighten us with your findings. For whom are we doing that?
Of course. So this sort of originated even before the first summit, this kind of discussion of repeating same mistakes. And so we've always tried to bring this balance, especially my colleague Fiona Thompson at Durham University has been very much leading the charge here. Who really benefits, or what are the ethics involved here, especially from an anthropological point of view and those points. I don't need to point out to this audience, the SpaceX at the moment does seem to be very much dominated by white men and obviously in some countries by people with huge amounts of resources and wealth. And we often say the benefits of space we want for all. But again, what does that look like in reality? I don't know if it's a conundrum or a paradox, but if countries with fairly advanced space programs start imposing regulations or whatever building material constraints, is this a barrier to entry for other states that, want to benefit from the utilization of space? And just these conversations that I think we have to be aware to. So I think it's very interesting. Here at this point in time, does space benefit? Who do we want it to benefit in the future? And how do we, again, don't make the same mistakes?
I think just asking the right questions is sometimes very important. And that's one of the ethos that we have on the space journalist side, not just to cheer the people that we love, really asking the hard and the tough question. And I love the question that comes out of this. Our theme is how can we avoid to make sustainability another form of space gatekeeping? And I think that brings it together on we use sustainability as a shield for us. We use regulation, we use a framework, we use tariffs, choose your weapon in this case, to dominate a market. If we want to stick in this radical wordings, because we are turning from defense to war now, even with the title of ministry. So we are going a more very straightforward way. Good. Question. Do policymakers really listen to academics? Or
Yeah, I think they do. They do. But I actually, and I say this, I think academics, especially in the UK, I think, dare I say, they're probably better in the US, give or take, but I think academics could do a much better job of informing and getting out their ivory towers and just doing that interaction. Again, obviously, this was one of the major motivations for the summit. I think it strikes me that there's so much excellence and expertise in universities. Again, I'm being a bit biased, but in UK universities, that I don't need a 25-page research paper. I do want the one page or the post-it note that I can say, this is what we found. Why does it matter? Question, as they say, so what? And this is what we can do about it. And I see this both from a technical point of view. I think a lot of folks have thought quite deeply and done experiments that will inform technical questions or, again, the upper atmosphere, these kind of discussions. But also, I think now from the legal point of view, I think people spend a lot of time and deep energy and deep thought tackling some of these moral and ethical questions. And a tiny example that I think is becoming apparent to me is to tackle space debris, we're going to have to think about registration convention, UN registration convention, and actually countries saying that, okay, we will unregister our space object so it can be clean, deorbited or something like this. How this works in practice, I don't know. But I think, especially for smaller debris, where you maybe can't trace the origin of a country or a state, there's got to be some creative legal solution here. And then that's got to filter up to governments, to policymakers, to UN level, this kind of discussion. But people have thought about this. And so do policymakers listen to academics? maybe not as much as they should, but I also think a lot of the onus is on the academics to promote findings, for example, that's not just in their own interests.
I know that I'm sailing hard on the wind here with you. Maybe you can give me your view on how do we ensure that academic insights, and you mentioned it's a huge value that is available there, especially on sustainability, translate into binding international norms and not just reports on shelves.
Oh, crikey. Yeah. How best to say this? There is progress. It's probably not at the speed or the rate one wants. And gathering, as we touched on, international consensus at this point is tricky. But I am definitely encouraged that there are enough like-minded states and like-minded individuals that changes are happening from legal committees, subcommittees, through to commercial activity. I'll be the first to admit that I get a little kind of disheartened or just, we're not doing this quick enough. But let me give you an example, which I've mentioned a couple of times, but I think is interesting and why I think something can become action and not just a report on the shelf. And that is not being universal. Not every state in the world has adopted this, but the UK has made some progress on space sustainability actually via a space security route. And this is essentially going to the UN, so not UN COPUOS or Office of Outer Space, but going to a committee on security and saying space is a security matter and sustainability is a security matter, and getting resolutions, again, signed by like-minded countries, so not everyone, but actually progress has been made using that avenue. And that, again, came out of, as I believe, policy discussions beforehand and from researchers. So, of course, my point here, I think there's many levers you need to pull and act on, and I think you need to do everything. Yeah, is the quick answer.
Nick, just one last final question here, and that's a question about your personal vision. So what does a truly sustainable space future look like in 2050 for you?
Oh, wow. I'll put some skin in the game, as they say. That's why I'm surprised considering everything that we said. I'm actually not concerned about low Earth orbit. I'm really not, or GEO for that matter. I think if it's going to be solved, it'll probably be solved by business interests. By 2050, you can think about recycling, in orbit, manufacturing, these kind of things. I think that's obviously happening now. So I'm actually really, in some ways, not that concerned about low Earth orbit, even the upper atmosphere. Okay, we can discuss that, but I'm way more concerned about the moon. I think there's just the impact that we're already, if we come talk about environment and ecosystems, there's no weathering on the moon. Whatever we do remains there for basically forever.
Right.
And so I think by 2050, we'll have either maybe permanently scarred the moon or figured out a way to operate there in a roughly either by safe zones, containment or something that has long-term use. Though that's why I don't know if that's a slightly pessimistic or realistic, but that's what I think on those kind of timescales I'm concerned about. And it's happening now, missions and failed missions on the moon, what have you. I think that really is where we're going to remake the biggest mistakes if we're not careful. And I don't think we're being that careful at the moment.
Dr. Nick Ross, thank you very much for your time and this very insightful conversation. If you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.